Hi, Rob. Thanks for joining me today to do this. I know it's been since what, 2017 when we first met?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I think this will be a great conversation to talk a little bit about work you're doing here in the Netherlands. But I always like to get started with, give us a little bit of the background and history on how you made it to this point in your career in life.
An unusual journey, I guess, in many ways. I studied as an engineer originally, ended up in the upstream oil and gas business, working in West Africa and then later in Iran and Dubai and various other locations. Stumbled into doing an MBA and then came back into corporate venture capital in the energy space. And after a couple of years doing corporate venture capital, we persuaded the corporation that spinning out the fund would be a good idea. So we spun out that fund as a clean tech energy fund to investors in London and the Middle East. So I stepped out of that organization into the GP management company. We grew the portfolio, which was by then quite a large portfolio in Europe, US, Asia, Canada, all sorts of locations. So that was, I guess, my introduction to venture capital, but very much from an engineering perspective, but big tickets and deep pockets nonetheless. And after a few years of doing that, I stepped out into some CEO positions in different portfolio companies, advising other VCs along the way, but all based in Europe. And by then I had a young family here in the Netherlands, was traveling arguably too much. So I looked for something more local and different to the energy industry, because I'd spent a lot of my time in energy. And yeah, I stumbled across the opportunity to work here in Leiden, helping commercialize the life science and health related research connected to the academic hospital and the university and the Leiden Bioscience Park. So that was about 7 or 8 years ago. And initially I ended up running the tech transfer office for a couple of years. And then eventually 3 or 4 years ago, ended up managing the holding company, which we sort of turned into a seed life science and health fund, very active investor in early stage life science and health. Which is in some way connected to a growing ecosystem here in Leiden, connected to not only the academic activities, but the park and the many other companies that we have here. So yeah, a varied background, but very much family planted here in the Netherlands now, although I am, of course, British.
So when I met you, it was in London in 2017. You were a faculty member for us, and I believe it was through some of the connections that we had with Erasmus, Leiden. At that point, we were trying to get more of the tech transfer offices engaged. We had asked you to come and speak and be a faculty member. You have been gracious enough to be a speaker at many of those early programs when we did them in London. I don't know if you ever went to the Paris program, but you sort of approached me 3 years ago with this idea of bringing the IBE here to the Netherlands. And I'm intrigued by what your plan was then and sort of how you've progressed in that thinking relative to why bring the IB to the Netherlands. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about how your thinking has evolved. Because when we first started this, it was going to be strictly Leiden. Yeah. And you've rethought that. So maybe talk a little bit about translation, taking ideas from concept to market, and how you're playing in that arena. Because we just had a couple sessions this morning talking about the mind of the investor, and you're that investor, but you've got a keen awareness and sense of, well, what's coming out of the academic institutions, and then how do we add value to that? So maybe you can talk a little bit about where you started in your thinking and how that's evolved.
Yeah, so you're right. I came as a speaker, I think, around 2017, 18, to the program in London. At that time, I was very much involved in the tech transfer office. And although I have a VC background, in that role, I had noticed that there was a gap in the Dutch ecosystem around startups and funding life science and health startups. And I was intrigued by perhaps connecting that to either the UK ecosystems, or what were the best ecosystems in Europe, and or is there a way of connecting this ecosystem to the US? So, and I was still struggling with that from a tech transfer perspective. So, yeah, of course, I was also struggling to recruit people from the Netherlands who I could see, academic researchers who would clearly benefit from the program. They either didn't have, a spare week to travel to London to do the program, or they didn't have the budget available for the program, or the travel, or the accommodation. And it was a combination of those things. So there was only a handful of people, academics, who were willing to make the journey to London and go through the program, even though I could see that was needed in order to give them the confidence to spin out their particular project that they were working on. And I saw that was consistent across the country, really. In all of these academic institutions, there was very few incubator programs, coaching for entrepreneurs, and not enough seed financing for those entrepreneurs. So there was a lot of gaps in the ecosystem, not only in Leiden, but across the country, relative to what I had experienced in my time in the UK, in the US, Canada, or wherever. So I was intrigued to solve that problem. In the interim period, of course, we had Brexit, which also added complication to getting people from France and the Netherlands to the UK to run the program. We also had COVID, which added to the travel restrictions, etc. So, and by then, I guess, fast forwarding a couple of years, the ecosystem that we had been building here in terms of incubators, more startups, more tech transfer was growing. And I thought it would be a good idea to get you to run the program from this location. It's English speaking, of course. You're still within the EU, easy for people across Europe to participate in the program. And because, I was keen to get more participation from our ecosystem, and then ultimately expand that from Leiden to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and I hope to Utrecht and Nijmegen and the other locations in the Netherlands.
So I think one of the things that intrigued me was when we first started this, you had talked about, and Leiden is such a robust environment for research, and it's a top tier university within all of Europe, not just within the Netherlands. But I thought it was interesting how one of the things you said to me at one point is, if I can elevate the entire country as it relates to this idea of translation, it only helps my cause. That it's not just about Leiden, it's about elevating everyone and creating an ecosystem where industry says we need to be in the Netherlands. And so talk a little bit about that, because I think that was an evolution in your thinking as well. I think a lot of it was university sort of focused initially, but now you've got this larger vision of what would benefit the community here.
Yeah, I think, I still struggle to understand it. I'd never been in an environment before where you have, high quality and high volume levels of innovation and science, certainly impactful in a life science and health context, but where there are so few investors, structurally very few investors, who are willing and able to invest in those and validate them and commercialize those ideas. It just didn't seem to make sense to me that you wouldn't have people, wanting to advance those ideas. And I knew from the various interactions in the US and the UK and elsewhere in Europe, that the level of innovation, the level of patents, the level of facilities and science that we have here is as good as anywhere else. So that to me was unusual, and I was struggling to understand why that was. I still struggle to understand why it is, but it's partly cultural, and we've had long discussions about that in the meantime. So yeah, one of the goals, I guess, that I set myself is, okay, I want to build the infrastructure and the ecosystem here to improve it in Leiden, but ultimately we're trying to have a much broader impact, which can be to improve the whole Dutch ecosystem and the connections between the Netherlands, life science, and the rest of Europe and the US, where those ecosystems are perhaps more liquid and there's more investors and more advisors and all sorts of benefits. But that's not to take the innovation out of the Netherlands and move it somewhere else. That doesn't help. As I said, the infrastructure here and the knowledge and facilities are as good as anywhere else. It's also not straightforward to bring investors from other countries and expect them to invest in a foreign country when they are surrounded by great deal flow and great science locally. So there has to be a bridge, and how we, in a structural way, create a bridge where knowledge is being shared across those different jurisdictions, and the financing and all of the difficult steps when it comes to commercialization is essentially what we're focused on. And that's a long journey, but there are organizations in Europe and elsewhere who show us what the best practices are. And certainly when you look at other European institutions, there are ways where you can improve it. There are recipes for success, and that is the sort of constant focus, where how can we improve that by, in many ways, copying the success of others, which in many cases is outside of the Netherlands. So
when I look at sort of the evolution of the last 3 years, this is our third cohort where we've done here in the Netherlands. What I'm seeing is that you've been able to attract innovators from beyond the Netherlands. I've seen projects that came from Italy, Sweden, I think UK, maybe Portugal,
Lithuania.
Lithuania.
Well.
So I think one of the things that you're doing is you're sort of saying the Netherlands can be a hub for this innovation. Some of the things that you and I are working on with some of the alumni are the ideas of getting U.S. funding and developing and enhancing the strategies for U.S. commercialization. Because obviously if you're a U.S. investor, you want to see that there's access to the U.S. marketplace. That's one of the primary things they're interested in. And so I think that some of these projects that you and I were discussing even this morning are sort of test cases, if you will, for how we can make that happen, sort of the evolution of the model. But why don't you talk a little bit about the success of the fund over the last few years, because I know you've had some pretty good successes as far as exits, and maybe talk about some of the factors that you think is lent to you seeing sort of a better progression in those investments and how they've matured and advanced and moved on.
Yeah, so of course there's one thing, identifying what the gap is in the investment ecosystem locally. And I should say that the challenges that the Dutch ecosystem have are no different to many of the other countries in Europe, which is in part why some of the entrepreneurs, when they see that there is an ecosystem and a bioscience park and investors and entrepreneurs succeeding in one location, they migrate naturally to that location because they can learn and develop. So I guess once you've identified that there is a gap, particularly in the early stage life science and health seed investment space, then the idea was jump into that space and start filling the gap. But when I stepped into the university holding company, I didn't have any investors. There was no cash, so I had to create a source of cash in order to invest at the early stage in relatively small amounts, and then build that up in a stepwise manner, but that required quite some, traditional VC seed investing skills to make sure that worked. So if I look back over the last 3.5 years, we've probably done 20 or so new investments, some follow-on investments as well. Typically investing, 3 or 4 million a year, but that 3 or 4 million had to come from somewhere, plus the operational costs. So we had to generate that cash, but also over a very short period of time, which is unusual, but we've managed to do that through a couple of successes. We did successfully exit a couple of companies just at the end of last year, beginning of this year, which essentially has created the cash flow that we can continue the operations for another 2 or 3 years, and then we have a number of exits in the portfolio. So you have to balance, if it's an evergreen fund and you're surviving on your own cash flows from the companies, then you have to balance the portfolio quite carefully in terms of the size of the investments to make sure you have access to co-investors so you don't run out of money, but also so that the timing of those exits is balanced. If you did everything in pharmaceutical or in therapeutics, the exits would take so long you would run out of money in the middle. So we balance the portfolio with medtech, which has, of course, a shorter duration, but also digital solutions, which has, again, a shorter horizon. And and then you need a network of co-investors, which, depending on whether you're in digital or maybe in oncology or in diagnostics or medtech or pharma, you can have access to certain types of angel investment, some high net worth individuals who perhaps want to focus on purely oncology, which is often the case, and you align them with the bigger goal, which is we're trying to fill gaps in the Dutch infrastructure. We're trying to bring more great life science and health innovation to market, and we're filling a gap that very few other investors are doing. And at the same time, you're doing it with a global perspective. So you have to be interesting from a UK perspective, from a Swiss perspective, from a US perspective, not just trying to, keep businesses alive that perhaps shouldn't be alive, which is often the case if you just rely on public money. So, the idea is to make these businesses sustainable and make sure you're putting the money in the right place. And that takes a lot of external input, not just sort of subsidy applications and local investment to keep local businesses alive.
In the time that you've sort of seen this model of yours maturing, what are some things that you would point to as being real advances that you've been able to make? And then what would be the things you see as sort of still major obstacles or challenges that you've got to try to overcome and address?
So I guess when I first arrived here, there were very few academics or scientists who wanted to be entrepreneurs. There was no incubation program, and we now have a couple of incubation programs, and I think across the country we're seeing more attempts at incubation programs, not always with the most experienced people coaching and mentoring, because there's a lack of experience in general in entrepreneurship and successfully building companies. So tapping into real expertise, the people who have been there and done that, is quite difficult because there's not enough of those people. Nevertheless, we have more incubator programs. We're seeing more scientists exposed to those programs. They see that other founders and scientists are starting up companies and getting money, which keeps the wheel turning. So then more and more people gravitate to that as a career opportunity. Do
you think it's uniform? I mean, in Leiden, you have a lot more, you've got better optics into it. Do you think it's occurring in some of these other universities, in other geographies within the Netherlands?
It's a good question. One of the reasons why in this year and last year that we opened the IBE program to other institutions, Amsterdam and Rotterdam in this case in particular, was to see how many startups were routinely being coming out of those ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And I can see it's still relatively few by comparison to Leiden. We see that also with the national subsidy application processes. There's a lot more life science and health startups coming out of Leiden in general. So I can see that the ecosystem here in all aspects, whether it's subsidies, the tech transfer, the infrastructure, the startups, the financing, here is probably more advanced than in other locations. But then, you know, we need to expand what we're doing and be inclusive of across the country, because you know, ultimately that's the goal, and there will never be enough deal flow if you just focus on one location.
No, there isn't any, even in the United States. Obviously, the large industry players will go to major academic institutions like a Stanford or an MIT or Harvard, but there's a ton of great science occurring at many of the universities, but they don't have the ecosystem as you're speaking to. A lot of it has to do with having the resource. I mean, one of the things about the IB, and I think you can give me your thoughts on this, it's not just the curriculum that this program provides. You know, obviously, I've got a dog in the hunt with the behavioral piece, and I think we could talk a little bit about that. And we've seen that it's been effective in helping us get, maybe not getting the innovator to become an entrepreneur, but them to understanding their limitations relative to being a complete entrepreneur, right? Yeah. That they can contribute to the entrepreneurial process, and the behavioral data helps us to have that conversation. But so you have those unique elements, but I think it's the network. Right. If you look at what we're doing, where we're starting to see success with some of these companies that we're looking to bring to the U.S., like Wouter and Marguerite, that's where we've been able to put U.S. team around them to start to help them understand the broader areas that they need to hone in on and refine their thinking and improve their approach to. So I think availing that to more people in this ecosystem only helps, right? If you know, if you can't bring the mountain to Muhammad, bring Muhammad to the mountain type thing, right?
Absolutely, and you know, it makes sense. A lot of the pieces of science that are coming out of these institutions, you know, it's complicated. So the broader the network, the more people who can look at it and see the value of it, the more likely it is to be taken forward. If the starting point is you have very few investors and they're only selecting the best of the best of the best, so 99% of it is rejected, then of course within that 99% there's really valuable stuff. So the broader the network, the broader the number of people with experience and knowledge and access to resources, financial resources and other resources, the more likely you are to make a positive impact and make progress. So I think on the deal flow side, we've definitely seen success. Within our very small fund and our activities, we're seeing success, but even more opportunity. And if we had access to more capital, we'd be able to do 10 times more, for sure. The incubation process where you're coaching and mentoring entrepreneurs, scientists who have elected to become entrepreneurs, that has some benefit, but you still, across Europe in general, see that there is considerably less experience in the quality of you know, C-level executive leadership of companies. And you know, in terms of how you prioritize time, resources, make, you know, clear pitches to investors, but also access to relationships that you need, whether it's relationships in big pharma or biotech or with VC investors, to be credible. Because if you have somebody who is already very credible and well known, of course people look at the deal more closely because it's already attracted somebody very, very credible. So it allows us to take a piece of translational research through a seed phase with the founders, but which then might attract a more experienced team or individual or exec or non-exec director, which has then the relationships or the knowledge to take it to the next phase. But it doesn't necessarily make brilliant entrepreneurs out of scientists. So I think we've tackled the deal flow side. We're allowing more of the deals to get funding through the seed phase. It still enables a natural transition when you then need to scale it up into bigger deal flow on a more global perspective. So I think we've made some progress there. It's still a work in progress, I think, structurally, to have large numbers or even a modest network of US scientists and investors structurally looking at the many deals that are coming out of the Dutch ecosystem, whether it's Leiden or the other ecosystems. So I think we're going in the right direction. Since Brexit, linking to UK ecosystems as well is also interesting, slightly more local, but of course they're in two different markets effectively now. So lots of these activities already exist in the UK, but bridging those to the EU market, particularly those that are successful in UK ecosystems, they need somewhere to launch from in the EU market. This is also a very logical, easy location for that, which can then still bridge from the UK to here and then from here to the US, for example. So I think the number of opportunities, if anything, are growing. And the more we evolve this and learn from these sort of dynamics and build the ecosystem, the more we then see from the other European countries that they're struggling with similar things. And some of it is, inherent, built into corporate law and tax law and all these sort of things. And some of it is a legacy of academic policy, where, they're struggling to find the right balance between academic involvement or public-private partnerships or, what's attractive to investors and what isn't. So, there's all sorts of ways that, we can ultimately expand this knowledge to be more effective.
It's the academic culture is a big part of it. We talked about this a little bit this morning, that the idea that if you have an investigator or a clinician, they're doing research, they're thinking about getting that next grant. They're thinking about bringing funds into their lab. They're not really thinking about commercial viability of the science. We talked about this a little bit at lunch. That's no different in the United States. Many of our academic institutions, I'm working with two large institutions. They both bring in over $1.2 billion a year in NIH funding, and neither of those institutions could find 5 technologies that are viable from a commercial perspective.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of capital, especially in the United States. We see this on the early side, translational, and there's merit to some of that work is trying to innovate and go in different directions. But at the end of the day, a large body of that work will never see the light of day. It'll never result in anything that commercially creates value. So, if you look at an ecosystem like Israel, they look at it and say, well, why would you invest in something that doesn't have some commercial viability? They're much more keen on trying to understand that commercial viability.
Yeah.
If you look at the Netherlands, it's a natural place for European innovators to come because it is English speaking, because there's just really high quality institutions here. There's a growing body of resources, the biopark being just one of those, where you're physically building the buildings and the resources that they would need to do that work. But I think one of the other interesting things would be is, as a result of the work that we're doing here and that we propagate through other organizations being interested, can we get more industry here? Can you find more biopharma executives that end up being located here because there is sort of this wealth of early science that they need to be tied to? That's what we saw happen in Cambridge, right? You had predominantly mostly pharmaceutical companies were located in New York, New Jersey, right? But then there was the mass exodus from New York, New Jersey on the East Coast to Cambridge. And I remember 20 years ago, you drive through parts of Cambridge and they were just old warehouses, and now they're skyscrapers, right? With every big company you can imagine's name on them. So a lot of that, I think, was that there was a realization that the institutions, the academic institutions, were producing great science, and that the drug companies needed to be closer to that science and the technical talent. And so they brought the commercialization talent to the ecosystem, which propagated more investment and more capital. So it was something that grew. It was always robust in Cambridge relative to other parts of the country, but it grew. So the question is, can we grow this? And again, and I'm setting you up for, what are models you'd want to emulate? You talked about it the other day. I don't want to steal your thunder on this, but what would be the models that you would try to emulate here, and where are you getting pieces of things that you're seeing be successful that you'd like to integrate or incorporate into what you're doing here in the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you're right. Universities primarily will focus on research and education, and more so in mainland Europe, you don't have that culture of entrepreneurship, of capitalism, of financing. It's very risk averse from an investment perspective. The ecosystems in the Netherlands that do generally work well with startups are the technical universities. Eindhoven and Delft in particular are well known for spinning out lots of engineering related startups. And that's attractive to angel investors. You need smaller amounts of money. It's shorter duration. You can reach an exit. When it comes to life science and health, you need deeper pockets, big professional organizations, and there are not enough of those. I think if you then take a step back and say, okay, which are the most effective European ecosystems, and what have they done differently to the Netherlands? Then the ones that I often look at, of course, are the Oxfords, the Cambridges, the KU Leuvens in Belgium. And if you look at how they are structured, they quite early on, decades ago, recognized that this is not a core academic activity. It's important for a university to do it, but you can't do it with academic people necessarily. So tech transfer offices can routinely be structured as a separate limited liability company, where you have a licensing team, an investment team, a social impact team, but the people who are working in those companies are external professional people, maybe with an investment background, with a commercial or business or industry background. So essentially operating outside of the university system, can be compensated differently, but certainly, it's a different type of background. Those offices can still be owned and managed through a shareholder agreement by the university, but you have a lot of external people on the board in the governance process. And as those companies grow and expand, licensing income or equity-related dividends flow into that. It allows it to grow. Then you can invest more and do more activities. You're not a burden on the university. The more successful it is, from time to time, you can dividend excess cash to the university. They can, build a new building or a lab or a facility, and that's great. So, but the focus from the university's perspective is, how do we maximize the impact on society from our knowledge and research and education and infrastructure, in terms of job creation, in terms of patient care, if it's life science and health, in terms of whatever. But it's not about managing and controlling every transaction. You leave that to professional people, with a sensible governance process. That is not the case in most of the academic institutions in the Netherlands, and almost certainly not in much of mainland Europe either. In the UK, it is structured in a more capitalist way, should we say. Mm-hmm. Here it tends to be academics doing the tech transfer, very few investment teams with real investment experience in an academic setting. So then you become dependent on either public sector subsidies or public sector investment organizations, which are naturally slow, and or subsidies, and all sorts of other, publicly funded programs, which, are not always the most efficient use of taxpayers' money, but also, lots of people involved, lots of additional bureaucratic steps. So if you want to make a very efficient ecosystem, I always start by saying, well, who does this well? Who does it efficiently? Who's the most productive? Who generates the most impact? And which of those benefit the university as well as, the ecosystem the most? And those are the ecosystems that I try and copy. And those, generally speaking, are not in the Netherlands. But then you're forced to change a lot of, structural, it's a completely different way of approaching the problem. And that's a painful, very slow thing to change structurally.
Is it possible? Is it possible to change the structure to emulate in Oxford? I mean, you were saying, what, 3,000 licenses, out licenses a year at Oxford? It'd be interesting to see, they realized that the capital from the execution of that license agreement, but it'd be interesting to see how many of those progress to another level. Right?
Yeah,
if you looked at a progression of those deals over a course of 10 years.
No institution can copy what Oxford or Cambridge does, because those are, enormous institutions with, an incredible level of science and productivity and deal flow and relationships and ecosystems. But their tech transfer process was set up many, many decades ago, way before most European academic institutions. So they have built up the deal flow, the licensing, and therefore the income. But also the UK is more focused, I think, on translational and commercialization, and has more access to more experienced CEOs. There's more investors. There's just more. They're more focused on translating research and investing and the whole ecosystem and job. It's more capitalist. Mm-hmm. And I think it is possible to get there, but it will take a lot longer before European countries significantly move in that direction, because there's so many things that have to change, not least how easy it is to set up a company, how easy is it to do shareholder transactions, mm-hmm. How easy is it to incentivize publicly employed academics in startup companies. Is that acceptable, and to what extent? How easy is it to get access to experienced CEOs and management teams? How easy is it to access experienced, knowledgeable scientific investors? And of course, then where do you get the follow-on financing for it? Is there a follow-on relationship with the US, through how do you get things through the regulatory authority, etc.? So I think there's a long way to go, but the starting point is there great science and innovation and infrastructure, and if we can make the seed investment available, and and have access to management teams and deal flow, then the rest can be done. It doesn't have to be done locally. It can be done with access to a broad network, which is international. I'm not going to be around for 50 years changing the whole ecosystem in the Netherlands, but if we can take those seeds and kernels of value and allow them to grow by connecting them with international networks of scientists and investors, then we're having a positive impact.
Do you sense that this next generation, there's people that are pursuing their PhDs or advanced degrees right now, that there's a higher interest in this entrepreneurial path, that there's a realization that the traditional academic path is just not as available as it may have been perceived to be 10 years ago even? I think that there's a difference definitely in this generation on many fronts, but COVID also has sort of spawned people to think about this idea of working from home and not being in an institution and not having to go to a place of work every day and doing something. What are your thoughts on that relative to what you're seeing?
It's a good question. I'm not seeing a noticeable change per se, but certainly there is more interest, I think, at the PhD postdoc level than the more experienced PIs with tenure, etc. Whether that's because those younger academics don't yet have tenure and they're not sure whether they will have a permanent academic career, or whether it's because they are motivated to have more of a practical impact on the world and want to explore entrepreneurship as a career. I don't know. I'm not seeing enough PhDs and postdocs jumping into the startup world, but they're certainly interested. They participate in some of the incubator programs, but I'm certainly not flooded with young PhDs and postdocs who want to become entrepreneurs. But logically, that is happening slowly.
Well, I think a lot of it, Greg mentioned this yesterday, the number one thing in the work that he had done was the number one thing they heard from academics was they didn't know how. They just don't know how to do it. Yeah. And I think there's even, you and I find the reluctance to even participate in a program like this. Yeah. It's like they have to see it before they understand what it is. Yeah. Right? And then they get here and they're like, wow, I wished I'd have done this. We have the one woman that couldn't make it last year. Yeah. And she said to me yesterday, gosh, I sort of wish I had done this last year. Yeah. Right? And so she's a year behind where she would have been in her thinking and her comprehension and her understanding. Now, the good news is she got here. The bad news is for every one of her, how many you and I have seen 10 that didn't come because I'm too busy, I need to be in my lab, I don't have the money. Yeah. We're going to spend it on buying a piece of equipment rather than learning how to use, use the equipment to create something that's viable.
They're busy applying for subsidies and competitions to get very small amounts of money to continue for the next few months, which are very time-consuming and sometimes painful, slow processes. But I think these kind of programs are really important, so that you can prepare and organize yourself to do something with a clear goal. Sometimes they're approaching these programs where they don't have a clear goal. They don't really know if life is going to be easier, being a career academic, or if life is going to be easier and more enjoyable and more impactful if they go the entrepreneurial route. And because this is still a relatively immature ecosystem, there's plenty of uncertainties about it. It's not an easy decision for people. But certainly, the starting point has to be to learn more, and I think these programs offer that opportunity, and makes the decision a lot easier. So, like I said at the beginning, there have been across the country a number of attempts using, public money to set up incubator programs where people learn the mechanics of setting up a business, but they still don't necessarily know who to go to get it done. Who's actually done it before? Who's succeeded? Where do I find this type of person or this type of person? Is this really validated? How is this going to be perceived by real investors in the real world relative to all the other things that are going on? What's the life cycle of the investors and the markets and the different technologies? What's hot and what isn't hot? Is this going to make sense within the coming 5 years to do it or not? Mm-hmm. These are all things that you learn here on this program, which makes your decision making a lot easier.
Well, and I don't think that they understand that being an entrepreneur isn't any harder. It's just different, right? If you're an academic, you're dealing with the political dynamic, you're dealing with the sort of the hierarchy of the educational system itself, right? That, if you're coming as a postdoc, the idea you're going to be a full professor, how many years you need to put in to get there, right? And the economics are, you can project, what you're going to make and what your life will be. Being an entrepreneur, yes, there's more unknowns, but there's an excitement to it. There's a gratification of knowing that I took something that was an idea and I cured a disease or I solved a problem. And like Greg said, it's almost like we're pushing drugs here, that once they see the path on how to do it, they become hooked.
Yeah.
We see it. You know, I was talking to one of our alumni last night who's a surgeon, and he said, you know, hopefully this company will be successful and I don't have to continue being a surgeon.
Yeah.
I can go do this new thing, right? Yeah. So there is, once they see the light at the end of the tunnel, like they see the path, like, okay, this is how you do it. These are all the components, because these are very bright people.
Yeah.
It's not an intellect problem. It's just an exposure problem. They just haven't been exposed to it. So I think the work that you're doing, I applaud you, because when we first started this 3 years ago, I didn't know where it was going to go. And I think we're seeing a maturing of certain deals that tell us, wait, we could create really high quality deal flow. We always knew the science was here.
Yeah.
We knew it wasn't a technical issue. It's an execution issue.
Yeah.
Right? It's executing on the science to get it to go through the various steps that's needed to show the worthiness of continued investment and support, and get it to a point where it can expand into different markets, whether it be US, throughout Europe, Asia, etc. But I think what you're doing is the foundation of it. And I've never seen, in all this time that I've been doing the translational stuff or the behavioral work, even at behavioral work, if I go to a large company like a Sanofi or an Alcon or those companies, Pfizer's, the companies we've worked with over the years, there's always people. It's not the company I'm working with. It's a person, it's a leader. Yeah. And so in this ecosystem, it's you. You're sort of the conduit to the investors, you know, the faculty that you've pulled together. You remember, we started this, it was a lot of US faculty. Now it's Netherlands faculty. It's people that you found in your community that are top notch, really high quality. And some of the interesting conversations I was having yesterday was the gentleman we had that did the section on IP. You know, he's an attorney, he represents a firm. I said, you know, your knowledge as a consultant to a bunch of these groups. And he said, well, how would I do that? I said, well, you know, you could talk to your firm about consulting outside of it, because as a consultant, you're not giving a legal opinion. You're giving guidance to tell them where to go look, what kind of questions to ask. And I said, so it's a way of getting more people exposed to the proper thinking. It doesn't require them to just have to hire you at $1,000 an hour. And he said, I never really thought of that. And I said, but you should think about it. Because I said, you know, you don't have to be formal counsel to be an advisor, to be a mentor, to help them to make sure they're asking the right questions. Because many times, you know, they're just not asking the right question. They're just, they're focused on the wrong things, right? And that's just not knowing what you don't know. So I think that's one thing. One of the other questions I wanted to explore with you, how do you think politics will play out in all of this? I mean, the U.S. has an election. Obviously, it's going to, you know, we're all waiting to see which way it goes. And there's a belief that it could affect investment. It could affect people's tolerance for risk. There's a lot of things. But how, as somebody in the Netherlands looking at it as a spectator, what are your thoughts on how you think it may or may not affect?
I mean, it's a good question. You know, at the beginning of each year, we sort of, you know, I provide information to our portfolio. We have events, and you know, we paint a picture of what the world market is looking at. Not because it necessarily changes the ability to raise, you know, pre-seed or seed funding into an early stage life science and health technology, but just to paint the context. There's a funnel. So, you know, the risks coming out of COVID was one level of risks. Then there was, you know, a perceived risk of recession and very high inflation, which of course was holding back investors. So, and then we got to a period where investors had really been holding on to their cash for, you know, 2 or 3 years. So a huge amount of cash had been built up. There was a number of, you know, there was an explosion in secondary related transactions because VCs funds were delayed in terms of their exits, partly because of those market dynamics. So there's all these things going on, which you can see play out, particularly in the Series B and C transactions. Even if you look at the historical data, the number and size of the seed-related investments in life science and health broadly speaking, doesn't dramatically change because they're relatively small tickets. But the more difficult it is at the later stage, the Series A and B and C, the more conservative investors are at the seed phase. And in particular, if you know it's going to be a flat round when you go through a Series B and a Series C, by definition, investors profit more by being later. So actually what has happened over the last 3 years is the seed gap has got bigger because many investors realize it's less risky and as profitable to be later. So the gap that we're playing in has grown, which means there's less people in the seed phase, which means you get better deals, higher quality deals at a lower price with a higher chance for success. So actually it's created, in my mind, a greater opportunity for those who are willing to play in that space with knowledge and access to capital. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have very deep pockets, because you often, the real concern investing at the seed phase is where's the follow-on financing, then you get dilution and so on and so forth. So it's not just the risk of the science and the team, it's what happens next. But there's lots of ways structurally that you can avoid that, as long as you're very efficient with the use of the capital. If necessary, you can stop cash burn and wait for the market to catch up with where you are with the science. But you can string the things along with relatively low cash burn in order, until you reach a phase where you have someone who's willing to pick it up in the next round. And that comes back to the network. The broader the network, the less time it takes to find the follow-on investment, and then you can succeed. But you're not burning huge amounts of cash, and it's not like you come to a brick wall. So there's lots of ways where you can invest very effectively at the seed phase and often without any competition. But you do need access and a way of validating high quality science and deal flow and have access to a broad network. So I still think that it sounds like it's a lot of work, but I think it's an untapped opportunity. And it's also an opportunity which is attractive to individuals, high net worth individuals, angels with knowledge. You can't replace a VC who is writing $10, $20 million checks in later rounds. But you can play very effectively and support management teams and use your network to help the business grow and achieve its goals as an angel investor at an early stage. I think it's really rewarding, and you have a direct feeling that you're adding value, helping bring a technology to the market which benefits patients. And you could even select what kind of field you're interested in. Many high net worth angel investors, they're really interested by being involved with validated good science, but they ultimately have had maybe a family experience with cancer, and they want to use some of their money to support businesses which are developing a particular oncology related therapeutic or diagnostic or whatever. And I think that network is very, it's very positive. It makes people enjoy participating. It's not just about what is the risk reward of the investment. It's a group of people with knowledge and resources that want to move the ball forward. And even though structurally the VCs might be later and later, and that's partly because of the market changes, that's a very rewarding space to be involved in.
I think one of the challenges you and I have is just getting the message out to the investment community that this model is doing it differently, that we are educating the innovator on how to understand the landscape and what they're going to have to navigate, that they're most likely not going to be the one that takes it all the way, that they're going to have to put a team around them, and that team has to be comprised of disciplines that they're not completely familiar with or don't have extensive insight into. One of the things I'm seeing out of the deals that you're bringing, or the projects you're bringing to the IBE, is that they're very efficient with their use of capital. I think they're doing a good job of getting to an inflection point for the money that's being put in. So I think that there's a maturing we're seeing of the ecosystem. And I think that we're seeing that. I think these projects that you're, in this third iteration, you said to me when we were walking back from lunch, more of these people are going to reach out to you after this than have in the past. And that means we're getting them to ask more questions. The whole idea of the IB, in a week, we're not going to teach them everything. We're just going to get them to understand they got to be asking a lot more questions.
Yeah, and part of the differentiation of this program is the connection to the US, as well as the knowledge of the coaches and mentors on the program. But many of them, and we even select those teams, these are not just academics who are sitting in labs in universities and medical centers who want to learn a bit about entrepreneurship, because they can do that in the other programs in the Netherlands. The real reason why the participants join this is because they are ready and interested to understand, okay, I need support or validation in the US, I need to jump into the US, I need access to investors in the US, or whatever. So by definition, they're slightly later in stage than perhaps the participants that you see in the US. But you're right, coming back to your first point, it's very rare that these founders, who are often scientists, end up being the CEO to lead the business at the end. And that's true of any business as it scales up. You go through the innovation phase and then eventually the growth phase, and it requires a different set of skills as the business grows. Most of them still actively participate in the process, and it's not that they failed when you change the management team. On the contrary, it's usually because it's reached a successful inflection point. It attracts more experience, more capital, more money, and it accelerates the next phase and the next growth. I think in the last 3 months we've changed 3 management teams, but in a positive way, because we're scaling up. We need access to more capital, and that requires more experience.
We were talking about it, and there was one project where the founders, the question that I've got to ask these founders of this one particular project is, what is your role going forward? What is your contribution going forward? And if that's your largest contribution is that you came up with the idea, and now the development and advancement of the idea is going to require other people, then you need to step aside and you need to realize that your position within the company from an equity perspective, from a compensation perspective, from a time perspective is going to be different. And that's okay. That's just, if the idea hadn't matured, that wouldn't be a requirement. It wouldn't be a decision point that we have to make and consider. So that's a good thing in my mind.
It's also a really positive thing, actually, for career development. So we've had a number of founder scientists who ultimately want to be chief scientific officers in a business, but they're not. They don't have the experience to write IP strategies and manage this and this and this. And they've never taken something into a clinic before. They've never even done the sort of preparation work to take something into the clinic. They're not familiar with necessarily all the detailed validation that is required to raise the capital in order to take something into the clinic. So, but from a career development perspective, if you achieve a certain milestone, which attracts a more experienced team and more capital, and then your career development becomes, how do I learn from this incoming CEO? How do I develop into a chief scientific officer? That's a career. Then you can jump into another business as a CSO and another business as a CSO, and you learn as you go along. And you're exposed then to more experienced CEOs who have taken things into a clinic. You experience the process of taking something into a clinic, and how to deal with investors maybe at the VC level at that point when you've raised the Series A. So it's not that you step aside and you're stuck where you were as a scientist. You develop your career in a positive way, which allows you to jump from one business to the next to the next. And maybe you start up another company and another one, and then you do have the skills to take something into the clinic or to be the CEO because you've developed.
It's not even a maybe. If you look at one of our US faculty members was a student of the program.
Yeah.
And now is a faculty member here in the Netherlands, right? Who's running a company and having success So I think it's a perfect example of that. It's not maybe, it does happen,
Yeah.
but it's like you're saying, it's time and game, right?
Yeah.
It's putting that time in. So,
Yeah.
I think that what started out as a sort of a business relationship and knowing each other is turning into just a wonderful friendship. And I appreciate your friendship. I admire what you're doing here because you're trying to do something that's difficult anywhere, and you're doing it in an environment where there are other factors that are unique to this environment that you're having to overcome. And I'm seeing the evidence of you overcoming them. I'm seeing the examples of success. Yeah. And as we find more and more of those, we'll be able to emulate and copy that and show others, well, this is the path that these people took in this environment. This is how they did it. So you're creating that opportunity, Rob, and it's no small thing. And I'm appreciative of being able to be part of it with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm by nature impatient, so everything that I see is much slower than I would like it to be. But no, we are making good progress, and I think having this bridge and connection with your team and Boston and the US, I think is fundamental to because otherwise you have to change everything structurally without having an alternative. So having these connections is fundamental to what we're doing. So no, I appreciate it very much, and I'm enjoying it.
Well, you said to me when we started this, an hour, and it's been an hour. So,
really?
So it goes quickly because it's something we're both passionate about.
Yeah.
We can both talk a lot about it, and
Indeed.
We could have spent, I could spend another hour asking you questions, but I think we'll call it a day today, and have you back and be able to talk about the evolution of this, maybe even next year when we're here in Leiden.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll do it again.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
You too.